We will be in chapter 12 this morning. And chapter 12 marks a transition in the Genesis story. We generally divide Genesis up into two sections, first 11 chapters, and then 12 through 50 after that. So things will be a little bit different here from this point on than what we covered earlier. So I hope you're enjoying it. I am, and I am learning a lot. It's amazing how many times you can read something. I don't know how many times I've read Genesis over the years, and there's always something to learn. When our family left the Bay Area and moved to Iowa in January of 2011, in a sense, we made a move by sight. Sure, it was a huge step of faith, but we had the luxury of the internet. We were able to look up and see what Eldridge and the Quad Cities had to offer. We could see what kind of people lived here. We could check rental prices for homes. I was able to go online and see if there was a Chipotle here. There wasn't, and I determined the closest one was in Iowa City. Then I asked people on Facebook what my options would be when I needed a Chipotle fix, and they said, go to Pancheros and Qdoba. Those are your best options. Not great options. They do not satisfy when you need Chipotle. Before ever visiting the Quad Cities, we already knew a lot about it. Leaving our family behind in the Bay Area was enormously difficult to do, and it was a huge step of faith, but in some sense, it was calculated. We had a home lined up to live in for at least a few months. I had my position as worship pastor at Cornerstone, and we were beginning to develop relationships with people through Facebook, all helping make things just a little bit less scary for the webs. Abram, he didn't have the luxury of the internet. He didn't have the luxury of consulting Google when he made his move. He first moved 600 miles northwest with his father Terah and family. Now he was about to move another 400 miles southwest, not knowing what and who awaited him there. So this morning we'll examine Abram's move that was purely by faith and way out of his comfort zone. If you're able, would you stand as we read from Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 9. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran, and Abram took Sarai his wife and Lot his brother's son and all their possessions that they had gathered and the people that they had acquired in Haran, and they set out to go to the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he moved to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed on, still going toward the Negeb. You may be seated. Now, last week, Genesis 11:31 read, Terah took Abram his son and Lot the son of Haran, his grandson, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go into the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. So they left Ur, which is down south of Babylon, and headed towards Canaan, but ended up making a long layover in Haran. And why did they make this trip? Well, it was simply because it was God's call to Abram. Verse 1 read, "Now the Lord said to Abram, 'Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you.'" God instructed Abram to go to Canaan. And when we consider this strictly from the immediate context of Genesis, the timeline of when God called Abram isn't so clear. Had God called Abram while he was in Haran, or had God called Abram when they were still in Ur, thus precipitating the move with Terah and his family? Fast forward nearly 2,000 years, Stephen was being interrogated by the Jewish Sanhedrin. The false accusers claimed that he was preaching against the temple and against the Torah. Acts 6:13 and 14 read, "They set up false witnesses who said, 'This man never ceases to speak words against this holy place and the law. For we have heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and will change the customs that Moses delivered to us.'" Stephen spoke with immense wisdom as the Spirit moved in him, and they just couldn't compete with his words, so they brought him to the Jewish leaders, that is the Sanhedrin. In Acts 7, 1 through 4, the high priest asked, "Are these things so?" Meaning, is it true that Jesus said he would destroy the temple? And Stephen said, "Brothers and fathers, hear me. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, that is, when he was in Ur, before he lived in Haran. And he said to him, 'Go out from your land and from your kindred and go into the land that I will show you.' And then he went out from the land of the Chaldeans and lived in Haran. And after his father died, God removed him from there into this land in which you are now living." So Stephen gave us the timeline. When Terah's family was still living in Ur, God revealed himself to Abram and told him to go to the land that Yahweh would show him. From the text, it seems that they'd intended to make their way all the way west to Canaan, to the promised land that we call it. But for some reason, they got stopped in Haran for a good number of years. Possibly even 60 years. When Terah, Abram's father, died at the age of 205, Abram continued the rest of the journey to Canaan at the age of 75. God had called Abram to something unknown, to a land he'd never been to and where he had no connections or relationships. Verse 6 tells us Canaanites were in the land, so there would be people Abram would have to contend with. Also, the name of the place Abram had been called to wasn't exactly flattering. Canaan means humiliated and is from the word kana, to bend the knee, humiliate, or vanquish. They were cursed because of Ham's behavior, would one day be servants of Israel, and they were despised by everyone else. That's who the Canaanites were. It's good to remind ourselves that when Abram was called, his understanding of Yahweh was quite limited. Joshua 24:2 reads, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, long ago your fathers lived beyond the Euphrates, Terah, the father of Abram and of Nahor, and they served other gods." Terah and his family served Nanah and other false idols of Ur. This was their natural tendency, and if they knew anything of Yahweh at all, it was probably in the context of throwing Yahweh into the mix with their false idols that they worshipped. Yet somehow, likely in Abram's youth, Yahweh had called to Abram and said, "Go to Canaan." This was a pivotal moment for Abram as God called him to a place that he didn't know, to worship a God he didn't yet fully know, so that he could be part of the story of bringing God's redemption to the world. Yahweh had called Abram to reject those other gods and to worship him alone. That's the call that went out to Abram. Leave your country and home and go to a place that I will show you. So next we look at the Abrahamic covenant. As we begin looking at the covenant, we first want to consider what a covenant is. Now, a covenant was a formal contract in the ancient Near East. It involved two parties, usually a superior, and that superior is referred to as a suzerain, and the subordinate is a vassal. This contract was legally binding. There are two basic types of covenants. There's a promissory covenant and an obligatory covenant. A promissory covenant unilaterally bound the sovereign to the vassal. In this case, the sovereign or the suzerain was committed to taking care of the vassal and to meet the vassal's needs. An obligatory covenant bound a vassal to the suzerain in a servant-like role, outlining the vassal's obligations to the suzerain. Should the vassal not uphold his side of the covenant, there would be consequences or curses, as it's sometimes called, and the covenant would become null and void. In the Old Testament, we see 4 primary covenants. As some people will say, there's other covenants. Yes, there are other forms of covenants, but there are 4 primary covenants in the Old Testament. First of all is the Noahic covenant. This was a one-way covenant where Noah and the rest of humanity didn't need to do anything. God had made a promise. The earth would continue to be evil and filled with sin, but God made a promise to not destroy it again. Then there was this one, the Abrahamic covenant. It governs God's unique relationship with Israel, giving them a home and a special place in God's eyes. And third is the Mosaic covenant. This is the covenant Yahweh established with the nation of Israel, declaring that if they would obey his laws, then they will receive blessing for it. But if they don't obey his laws, then they would experience curses. Then lastly is the Davidic covenant. One day, one of David's sons would reign on the throne and establish God's peace and blessing over the nations and for the rest of eternity. Now, normally, when two parties wanted to establish a covenant, first they would set the terms. Then animals would be sacrificed and their carcasses would be arranged on the ground in a manner that created a path through them. So one half on one side, the other half on the other side, creating a path. Passing between the halves of the animals was a sign that each party swore to uphold their end of the covenant. This was the norm when establishing a covenant. But this isn't what happened with Abram. In chapter 15, here in a few chapters, we'll see that Abram prepared the animals and made the path. But when the moment came to ratify the covenant, God put Abram into a deep sleep, and then only God in his glory passed between the animals. God was the only one to ratify the covenant, meaning that God's people, that is, the vassals in this covenant, couldn't break this promissory covenant. There were no stipulations for Abram to keep, and God was forever committing himself to Abram and his descendants. That's what a covenant is. But now let's look specifically at the 3 promises of the Abrahamic covenant. Some will say, oh, there's 3. Some will say there's 4 promises. Some will say there's 7 promises made here. Yes, you can find all these things, but we will distill it all down to 3 promises that are made here. The first promise begins in verse 1 and culminates in verse 7. God said to Abram in verse 1, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And then verse 7 says, then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. God promised Abram land. So what was the land that was promised to Abram and his descendants? Well, we can see a representation of that on this map here. The purple section outlines everything that God had promised Abram and his seed. And this is outlined, we'll come back to the map in a moment. This is outlined in Genesis 15, 18 through 21. It says, on that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites, Perizzites, all the sites. So the southern border, if we look at the map again, the southern border, the river of Egypt, some people say, oh, the river of Egypt, that must be the Nile River. No, it is not generally understood to be the Nile River. The river of Egypt is generally understood to be Wadi al-Arish, which is a dry riverbed that floods during the rainy season, and it's there in the Sinai Peninsula, and it flows north to the Mediterranean Sea. The northern border is the Euphrates River, all the way up in Syria and Turkey. Then there are all sorts of other markers in the text to help us understand the borders of the land God was promising to Abram's descendants. The green is the land Joshua's generation actually settled. That is what they settled when they came into the promised land. And then the red outline is the modern state of Israel, of course, with the West Bank cut out of it. Now, Yahweh had promised Abram that he would receive all of the land in purple. Yet, at no point in its history have Abram's descendants ever occupied all of this territory. So that's the first promise. And the second promise was to make Abram a great nation. The second promise is to make of Abram a great nation. Verse 2 says, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great. Remember, Genesis 11:30 told us Sarai was barren and she didn't have a child. However, in chapter 15, God tells Abram his descendants will be as numerous as the stars. It must have been hard to imagine that coming to be, and it would still be another 25 years before Yahweh would fulfill this promise to Abram. The first 11 chapters of Genesis showed humanity determining right and wrong for themselves, exercising their own wisdom to seek their own fame. The builders of the city and the tower, or ziggurats in Babel, sought to make a name for themselves. Yet here, God said that he would make Abram's name great. Chapter 12 is a demonstrable shift. A follower of Yahweh receiving a name simply by divine grant. A great name points not only to Abram's reputation, but also to the fact that God would literally change Abram's name. His name was changed from Abram, which is high father, to Abraham, which is father of a multitude. one day there would come a literal fulfillment of the promise to make of Abram a great nation. But the promise didn't stop with physical descendants. Galatians 3:7-9 says this: "Know then that it is those of faith who are the sons of Abraham. And the scriptures, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel beforehand to Abram, saying, 'In you shall all the nations be blessed.' So then, those who are of faith are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith." The true sons and daughters of Abraham aren't just those who are physically descended from him, but are those who share in his faith. Romans 4:16 says, "Abraham is the father of us all." The third promise in the Abrahamic covenant was that he and his posterity would be a blessing to the world. They would be a blessing to the world. Verse 3 reads, "In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." This is the spiritual component to the promise, and it centers around the fact that Yahweh had chosen Abram and his future family to be the ones through whom God would bring salvation to the world, the ones through whom the seed of the woman would come. The blessing lies in the fact that freedom from the curse, this freedom was prophesied in Genesis 3:15. It was to come through Abram and his family. A couple thousand years after Abram, a new covenant would be established by Jesus, the Christ, the Messiah. Jeremiah spoke of the new covenant being the ultimate fulfillment of this blessing. Jeremiah 31, verses 31-34. There's a number of slides here, but I have it all on the screen. "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And no longer shall each one teach his neighbor and each his brother, saying, 'Know the Lord,' for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more." This is the blessing. God forgiving sin and putting it out of his mind. One day, when we realize the ultimate fulfillment of that blessing, we'll have full knowledge of Yahweh. Now, let me read verses 2 and 3 again. "And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Now, there's a lot that I can't necessarily go into this morning about that blessing, but the use of this word bless, or a derivative of it, is mentioned 5 times. The text is communicating something new to us. This is a new sentiment, something different than what we primarily saw in the first 11 chapters. There were a few times where God would bless his creations, but now God was imparting blessing through this particular family line. And the repetition of the verb bless reverses the predominantly negative experiences of chapters 3-11. Now, through Abram, people everywhere can experience God's favor. This is a profound turning point within history and the book of Genesis. God had called out to Abram, had told him of the promises to come, and so now we look at Abram's response. First of all, Abram had a response of obedience. Verses 4 through 6 read, "So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And Abram took Sarai his wife and Lot his brother's son and all their possessions that they had gathered and the people that they had acquired in Haran, and they set out to go to the land of Canaan." Abram's response of obedience meant that he took his whole entourage. It wasn't just Abram, Sarai, and Lot making the journey. By this point, after some probably 60 years in Haran, Abram and Lot had acquired a pretty large retinue of people. Yahweh had materially blessed them, and they had many belongings and people who worked for them, helping take care of the animals and all their property, everything that needed to be done. Abram responded to God in obedience. He could have chosen to not obey, instead staying in the comforts of Haran. It was a nice city with a number of beneficial amenities, especially since it was at the crossroads of an important trade route. Instead, Abram chose to step out of his comfort zone. He heeded God's call and opted for a life of nomadic tent dwelling. Abram responded in obedience to Yahweh. He also had a response of worship. Verses 7 and 8 said, "Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, 'To your offspring I will give this land.' So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he moved to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord." Building these two altars was a response of worship. Now you might be wondering, what exactly was an altar? What did it look like? Well, throughout history there have been varying versions of altars. They could be something from a single, simple, large stone, perhaps a pile of unworked stones, or something much more elaborate like the temple altar, something like you see there on the right. Altars were erected out of devotion to God and were a place to offer sacrifices. They also served as a claim on the land and a testament to future generations of what God had done. So Abram built these two altars at Shechem and near Bethel. Now Shechem is in Samaria, or the West Bank, and is about halfway between Jerusalem and the Sea of Galilee, and it becomes an important location. It's not just the scene of Abram's first altar built in worship to Yahweh, but Shechem is strategically located in the pass between Mounts Ebal and Gerizim. This is where, hundreds of years later, Joshua calls the people to recite the blessings from Mount Gerizim and the curses from Mount Ebal. Joshua also built an altar on Mount Ebal to renew the covenant that had been given to Israel. Abram's altar at Shechem near the Oak of Moreh was the first of 4 altars that he built. And the second altar he built, by the way, the altar that Joshua built there, I just saw this just happened to be, I had an email sent to me that showing where it was and the remnants of it. Kind of amazing to see something like that. The second altar that he built was between Bethel and Ai. The label Bethel actually is a later addition, because at the time when Abram was there, when Abram built the altar, this was actually called Luz. And this place is just 20 miles south of Shechem. Now, there's speculation that this might be Abram's altar at Luz. We don't know for sure, but it seems to be quite old. So perhaps that's it, and that looks much more like one of the larger altars. Luz eventually becomes important in the story, since Luz is where Jacob has a dream of a stairway to heaven, and he renames the place from Luz to Bethel, meaning house of God. So Abram's building an altar was a worshipful response, and in a sense, it laid claim to the land that Yahweh had promised them. Abram's responses of obedience and worship were also expressions of faith. So his responses of obedience and worship were expressions of faith. Hebrews 11, verses 8 and 10 read, "By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God." As I mentioned earlier, when Abram arrived in the land, the Canaanites were there. These were the descendants of Ham, the recipients of the curse after Ham humiliated his father Noah in the tent. Well, these were cruel, corrupt people, and they become quite problematic in Israel's history and in the biblical story. Abraham had left all the comfortable environs of Ur and Haran. Now here he was, roaming around the wilderness, living in a tent and hoping for the best as he attempted to occupy this land that God had promised, but which was already inhabited by problematic people who no doubt would not have wanted him in the land. But Yahweh was with Abram and his entourage. It was in this setting that God issued the covenants, the promises of land, a nation, and to be a great name, and also to be a blessing to the world. And this is the first significant covenant in Israel's history. How would Abraham respond? How would his descendants respond? God promised the land to them. Would they go in and take it? They certainly become a great nation of people, and we have become recipients of the blessing promised to Abram. As we close, it's good for us to consider our own lives. Yahweh's first call is, first of all, for us to receive the blessing that comes through Abram, to receive victory over the curse, victory that comes through Jesus Christ. Beyond that, though, the question is, what's your response when God calls you to something great and perhaps even fearful or daunting? Do we respond in obedience? Or does your obedience take a long time, possibly looking more like disobedience, just as Abram was in Haran for 60 years after he had received the call? When you respond, is it begrudgingly, or is it in a spirit of worship and submission? Yes, God, I will do what you say. Lastly, where's your faith? Do you struggle to believe that God will do what he said he'll do? Or do you boldly step into that calling knowing full well that God will provide for what he has called you to. When God calls, he provides. Let's bow our heads and close our eyes. As we approach this time, and we look at our own lives, and you may have something before you that looks daunting. These can be all sorts of things, from maybe work, a new position that is, you feel like you're in over your head. Maybe things are difficult at work and you're hoping you can just stick it out. Raising children to be followers of Christ, influencing people around you. There are a number of things in our lives that could be potentially daunting. But God has called us to influence and to reach those around us. So the question is, how will we respond? Do we lack faith? Or will we respond in faith, trusting that God will work when we step out? God will work in the parenting of our children. God will work in the situation at our job. God will work in whatever it is that seems daunting and nearly impossible. Trust in him. He's great. He's greater than anything that we face. So trust that he will work. God, we thank you. Thank you for your presence in this place this morning, your word to us, the model of Abram stepping out into something that would have seemed quite daunting, and then his faith to trust that you would work as you said. May we follow his example. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.